Silas Vane stood by the fireplace, the orange light dancing in his eyes like a demon. In his hand he held a single piece of parchment, the manumission papers he had signed 3 years ago. He looked at Zebedee, the man who had kept his clothes white and his house running for a decade, and he didn't see a human being. He saw a piece of property that was too expensive to let go. With a flick of his wrist, Silas tossed the papers into the embers. He watched the ink bubble and the edges curl into black ash. He thought that by burning the paper, he was burning the truth. What he didn't realize was that some fires don't stay in the hearth. Some fires follow you into your bedroom, into your clothes, and eventually right up to the gallows. Silas believed his status as a gentleman protected him from the blood on his hands. He thought a man who washes clothes has no power, until his finest linens were treated with the searing oil of stinging nettles. The secret to a federal murder was sewn into the very waistcoat that was now making his skin crawl off his bones. By the time the sun sets on this garden party, his own physical agony will force him to drop the evidence that leads straight to the gallows. The Vane estate sat on the edge of the county like a vulture waiting for something to die. It looked grand from a distance, with white pillars and manicured lawns, but if you got close enough you could smell the rot. Not the rot of the swamp, but the rot of a man whose bank accounts were as empty as his soul. Silas Vane was drowning in gambling debts. He owed money to men who didn't take excuses, and his only hope was the rich land to the north, land that didn't belong to him. Zebedee knew the rhythm of the house better than anyone. At 46 years old, his life was measured in the steam of the laundry room and the harsh scent of lye. He was a man of silence and observation. He knew which rooms held secrets and which coats held lies. He had been promised his freedom for years, a reward for his loyalty and his unmatched skill in chemistry and fabric. But Silas had lied. The day the papers burned, something in Zebedee didn't break, it hardened. He watched Silas smirk as the last bit of white paper turned to grey dust. Silas told him he was needed for the harvest, that he was too valuable to be a free man just yet. It was a death sentence disguised as a compliment. Look closely at this. Some people call this custom, but it's just cruelty with a name and a surname. Zebedee went back to his laundry shed, his hands steady even as his heart hammered against his ribs. He knew Silas was hiding something bigger than a broken promise. For weeks, Silas had been coming home late. His horses lathered in sweat and his boots caked in a specific kind of red clay found only in the deep woods. Then a federal land surveyor named Mr. Henderson went missing. The word around the county was that Henderson had been sent to verify land titles, titles that Silas Vane claimed he had purchased in a private sale. But the townspeople whispered that the titles were forged, and the man who could prove it had simply vanished into the trees. The atmosphere at the plantation grew heavy. Silas was jumpy, snapping at the housegirls and drinking his bourbon before the sun even hit the midpoint of the sky. He was waiting for something. He was waiting for his father-in-law, Colonel Sterling, to arrive for the annual summer gala. The colonel was a man of the law, a magistrate who valued the Sterling family name above all else. If Silas could convince the colonel that his new landholdings were legitimate, the Sterling fortune would back his debts, and Silas would be untouchable. But the dead have a way of sticking to the living, and usually they stick to the clothes. It happened on a Tuesday. The air was so thick with humidity you could almost chew it. Silas returned from a business trip looking like he had crawled through a gutter. He didn't speak to his wife. He didn't speak to the overseer. He went straight to his study and stripped off his heavy wool traveling coat, throwing it onto the floor. He called for Zebedee to take it away and make it look new again. When Zebedee picked up the garment, he felt it immediately. The coat was unusually heavy on one side. It wasn't just the weight of the fabric or the brass buttons. There was something hard and cold tucked deep into the lining, something that shouldn't have been there. Zebedee took the coat to the laundry shed, away from the prying eyes of the house staff. He didn't start with the soap. He started with his fingers, tracing the seams of the inner pocket. The fabric had been crudely restitched, as if someone had tried to hide a lump in a hurry. He took a small seam ripper and carefully opened the threads. Out fell a heavy gold pocket watch with a cracked crystal. It was beautiful, expensive, and engraved with a very specific federal eagle. Beneath it, tucked even deeper into the wadding, was a brass seal. the official seal of a United States land surveyor. Zebedee's breath caught in his throat. This wasn't just evidence of a crime. It was a death warrant. If he was caught with these items, Silas would claim Zebedee stole them, and Zebedee would be swinging from a cedar tree before the sun went down. But if he did nothing, Silas would win. Silas would keep his stolen land, his stolen money, and his stolen man. Zebedee looked at the watch. There was a dark reddish-brown stain on the fob. It wasn't wine. It was a spray of blood that had dried into the gold links. The surveyor hadn't just disappeared. He had been butchered, and Silas had been foolish enough to keep the trophies. Why would a man as careful as Silas keep such things? The answer was simple: greed and panic. He couldn't leave the watch at the scene, and he couldn't bring himself to throw away something so valuable. He thought he could hide it in the one place no one would ever look: the seams of his own clothes, handled only by a man he considered a piece of furniture. It was the logic of a man who thought he was a god among insects. Zebedee realized that the wine stain Silas had complained about on the cuff was actually the spray from a dying man's final moments. As Zebedee sat in the dim light of the laundry shed, the plan began to take shape. He couldn't go to the sheriff. A black man's word meant nothing against a vein. He couldn't go to the colonel yet. He needed Silas to be vulnerable. He needed Silas to lose his mask of dignity in front of the world. Zebedee looked out the window and saw the stinging nettles growing thick by the creek. Most people avoided them. They knew that one touch of the leaves would leave your skin screaming in pain for hours, covered in white welts that felt like fire. To most, it was a weed. To Zebedee, it was a tool. He knew the science of it. He knew that if you boiled the roots and the leaves down into a concentrated reduction, you could create a clear, odorless liquid that held all the venom of the plant. If that liquid was soaked into fabric and allowed to dry, it remained dormant. But the moment it touched warm, damp skin, like the skin of a man sweating during a summer toast, it would react. It would soak into the pores and turn the simplest movement into an agonizing torture. Zebedee began to work. He didn't just wash the coat. He treated the inner linings of Silas's formal waistcoat and his intimate linens. He worked with the precision of a surgeon. He re-sewed the federal seal and the watch into the coat, but this time he placed them in a way that they were held by only a single weak thread. They were like ripe fruit, waiting for the right moment to fall. Every time Silas moved, every time he twitched from the sting Zebedee was preparing, those heavy metal objects would bounce against his ribs, reminding him of his sin, until the thread finally gave way. The next morning, Silas entered the laundry room. He looked tired, his eyes bloodshot. He paced the small space, his boots clicking on the stone floor. "Is it done, Zebedee?" he barked, his voice thin and nervous. Zebedee didn't look up from the vat of boiling water. "Almost, Master Silas. The stains were deep. They required a special soak." Silas paused, his gaze darting toward the coat hanging on the rack. "You didn't find anything in the pockets, did you?" The air in the room seemed to freeze. Zebedee felt the weight of the hidden watch pressing against his mind. "Pockets were empty, sir, just dust and lint." Silas grunted, seemingly satisfied, but he didn't leave. He walked over to the coat and ran his hand down the sleeve. Zebedee watched him, his heart a steady drum in his chest. Silas was looking for the lump. He felt the lining, and for a second, a look of relief washed over his face. He could feel the watch. He thought it was safe. He thought his secret was literally tucked under his arm, guarded by the very man he had betrayed. "Make sure my formal wear is ready for the colonel's arrival tonight," Silas ordered as he turned to leave. "If there is so much as a wrinkle in my shirt, I'll have the overseer show you what happens to lazy workers." He didn't wait for an answer. He walked out, leaving the scent of stale bourbon and fear behind him. Zebedee waited until the footsteps faded. He then reached into a jar hidden behind a crate of soap. Inside was the dark, concentrated essence of the Nettles. He took Silas's finest silk undershirt, the one he would wear beneath his formal waistcoat to impress the colonel. With a steady hand, Zebedee began to apply the liquid to the fabric. He focused on the areas that would press hardest against the skin: the underarms, the small of the back, and the neck. He knew that by tonight, the temperature would be 80 degrees with no wind. Silas would be sweating. He would be nervous, and as he stood before the colonel to give his toast, the fire of the Nettles would wake up. The man who thought he could burn a man's future was about to find out how it felt to be the one consumed by the flame. Zebedee hung the shirt to dry, a silent shadow in a room full of steam, preparing a trap that required no weapon but the truth and a little bit of nature's spite. The game was set, and Silas Vane had no idea he was already wearing his own destruction. Silas Vane didn't just steal a man's future when he threw those freedom papers into the fire, he started a clock that he couldn't stop. He stood in the hallway, adjusting his silk cravat, unaware that the man he had just robbed was currently holding Silas's life in a pair of wooden tongs. The embers in the fireplace were cold, but the air in the Vane estate was getting hotter by the minute. Silas had a problem that went deeper than a few burned papers. He owed $5,000 to a syndicate in Charleston, and the men who held those notes didn't care about his family name or the pillars on his porch. They wanted gold, or they wanted land. And if Silas couldn't give them either, they'd take it out of his hide. But what Silas didn't realize was that the very man he thought he had under his thumb was the one preparing the trap. Notice this. Some people call this tradition, but it's cold-blooded cruelty with a family name. The power dynamic in the house was shifting, though the walls were too thick for Silas to hear it. Zebedee sat in the laundry shed, his burned fingers throbbing. He had rescued the watch from the lye vat just minutes after Silas left, but the price had been the skin on his knuckles. He didn't care. The watch was safe, wrapped in a piece of oilcloth and hidden inside the hollow leg of a heavy wash table. But the pressure was mounting. That morning, Silas had walked into the kitchen and told the cook that if the harvest didn't cover the debts, he was going to sell Zebedee's daughter Sarah to a trader headed for New Orleans. It was a move of pure desperation. Silas needed a quick infusion of cash to keep the creditors away until the colonel could be convinced to sign over the northern titles. Zebedee heard the news through the kitchen window. He didn't drop the iron he was holding. He didn't scream. He just felt a cold, sharp clarity wash over him. The time for waiting was over. He needed to test Silas. He needed to see how much the man was already unraveling. That afternoon, Zebedee accidentally scorched the sleeve of one of Silas's secondary linen shirts. It was a minor mark, something that could be hidden under a waistcoat, but it was enough to trigger a reaction. When Silas saw the mark, he didn't just yell. He lunged at Zebedee, his face turning a dark, bruised purple. He grabbed Zebedee by the collar, his breath smelling of sour mash and tobacco. "You're trying to ruin me," Silas hissed. "Everything is falling apart, and you're mocking me with your incompetence." Silas didn't realize he was admitting his own weakness. He was terrified. He was a man standing on a glass floor, and he could hear the cracks spreading. He let go of Zebedee and stumbled back, his eyes darting toward the window. He was looking for the colonel's carriage. He was looking for an escape, but there was no escape from what was already in the room. Lurleen, the housemaid, entered then, her face pale. She had been cleaning the rose bushes near the porch and had found a scrap of paper caught in the thorns. She didn't give it to Silas. She saw the madness in his eyes and waited until he left the room. She handed the scrap to Zebedee. It was a corner of a map, water-stained and torn, with the signature of Mr. Henderson, the federal surveyor, clearly visible. The evidence was gathering like a storm. Zebedee now had the watch, the seal, and a piece of the map. But he knew he couldn't just present them. He needed Silas to break. He needed Silas to be the one to reveal the truth. The problem was that Silas was becoming increasingly paranoid. That night, Silas returned to the laundry shed with a lantern. He didn't call for Zebedee. He just started tossing baskets, looking for something. He was looking for the watch. He had realized, perhaps in a moment of sober clarity, that he hadn't checked the coat as thoroughly as he thought. If you can't stand a well-dressed lie, subscribe. And tell me, was that gold watch a warning or a death sentence? Zebedee watched from the shadows of the tool shed. He saw Silas's shadow stretched long and distorted against the wooden slats. Silas was frantic. He was ripping at the seams of other coats, his movements jerky and desperate. He didn't find the watch, but he found something else, the jar of nettle reduction Zebedee had been preparing. Silas picked it up, squinting at the clear liquid in the moonlight. He uncorked it and sniffed. It smelled like nothing but damp earth. He tossed it aside, the glass miraculously not breaking as it landed in a pile of soft wool. Silas left the shed, cursing under his breath. He was convinced he had misplaced the watch in the woods, or perhaps buried it with the body. He didn't suspect the laundryman. Why would he? In Silas's world, a man like Zebedee didn't have the imagination for theft, let alone for justice. But the accident with the shirt and the frantic search had confirmed one thing. Silas was on the edge of a total collapse. He was physically shaking. The stress was causing him to sweat even in the cool night air. This was the opening Zebedee needed. The next day was the day of the gala. The estate was a hive of activity. Florals were being draped over the railings, and the smell of roasting pig wafted from the pits. But in the laundry room the atmosphere was clinical. Zebedee took the silk undershirt Silas intended to wear. He didn't just soak it in the nettle juice. He used a small brush to paint the concentrate into the seams of the armpits and the collar. He knew that once Silas started his speech, once the heat of the candles and the pressure of the colonel's gaze hit him, the reaction would begin. It wouldn't be a sudden pain. It would start as a tickle, then a tingle, then a slow creeping fire that would feel like thousands of invisible needles sinking into his pores. The colonel arrived at 4 o'clock. He was a tall man with a silver beard and eyes that looked like they could see through a stone wall. He greeted Silas with a stiff nod, his disapproval of Silas's management already evident. The colonel had heard the rumors of the gambling. He had seen the state of the North Fields. He was here to decide if Silas was a man worth saving or a liability to the sterling name. Silas was desperate to impress. He was wearing his finest suit, his hair slicked back, his voice pitched high and tight. He looked like a gentleman, but beneath the silk and the wool the first drops of sweat were starting to form. Zebedee stood in the back of the kitchen, watching as Silas led the colonel into the dining room. He saw Silas adjust his waistcoat. He saw him scratch his neck, just a small absent-minded gesture. It had begun. The nettles were waking up. The chemical reaction was starting to bite into Silas's skin. Every movement Silas made to be polite, every bow, every reach for a wineglass, was rubbing the poison deeper into his flesh. Silas tried to smile, but his lips were beginning to twitch. He felt a sudden, sharp sting under his left arm. He thought it was a spider. He shifted in his seat, trying to put distance between his skin and the fabric, but the fabric followed him. The colonel was talking about the Surveyor. "Funny thing, Silas," the colonel said, his voice echoing in the quiet room. "The federal office sent a letter. They're worried about Henderson, said he was last seen heading toward your north line. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you?" Silas felt a wave of heat wash over him. His back was now a sheet of fire. He felt as if someone was pressing a hot iron against his shoulder blades. "No, sir," Silas managed to say, his voice cracking. "Haven't seen him. Probably got lost in the swamp. It's easy to do." Silas reached for his water, his hand trembling so violently that the ice clinked against the glass. He could feel the watch in his pocket. It felt heavier than usual. It felt like a lead weight pulling at his side. He felt the seal rubbing against his ribs. The weak thread Zebedee had used was starting to fray from the constant, agitated movement of Silas's body. Every time Silas flinched from the sting of the nettles, he was sawing away at the only thing keeping his secret hidden. The pain was becoming unbearable. Silas's vision began to blur at the edges. He could hear the blood rushing in his ears. He wanted to scream. He wanted to strip off his clothes and jump into the icy water of the rain barrel. But he was trapped. He was trapped by the colonel's gaze, by the guests arriving in the garden, and by his own desperate need to appear in control. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself, but the movement only caused the collar of his shirt to grind the nettle juice into his throat. He looked like a man having a stroke. His face was bright red, and sweat was pouring down his forehead, stinging his eyes. "Are you quite well, Silas?" the colonel asked, his brow furrowing. "You look as though you've been caught in a hornet's nest." Silas tried to laugh, but it came out as a strangled wheeze. "Just the heat, Colonel. A bit of a summer fever, I suspect." He stood up, intending to excuse himself for a moment, but the sudden movement was the final straw. The pain flared into a blinding white heat. He let out a small involuntary gasp. He felt the watch shift. He felt the seal slip. Subscribe. We unearth what they tried to bury. And tell me, do you think everyone in that house knew the truth, or did they just choose to look away?" Silas reached out to steady himself against the table, but his fingers were numb. He didn't see the way Zebedee was watching him from the doorway, his face a mask of cold, hard justice. Silas thought he was fighting a physical ailment, but he was actually fighting the ghost of every lie he had ever told. The fire was no longer in the hearth, it was under his skin, and the first spark of the explosion was just seconds away. Silas Vane was a man who believed that if you buried a secret deep enough in the mud, it would eventually become part of the earth. He didn't understand that some things are too toxic for the soil to hold. As he sat at the head of his long mahogany dining table, the flickering candlelight reflecting off the expensive silver, he felt a strange sensation on the back of his neck. It wasn't the heat from the kitchen or the pressure of the Colonel's silent judgment. It was a tingle, a tiny rhythmic prickling that felt like 1,000 invisible gnats were dancing on his skin. He reached up with a trembling hand to adjust his silk collar, but the movement only made it worse. What Silas didn't know was that he wasn't just wearing a shirt. He was wearing a trap, woven from the very essence of the woods where he had committed his crime. The stinging nettle juice, dried and concentrated into the seams of his clothes, was waking up. Look at this. Some people call it tradition, but it's just cruelty with a fancy name. Silas tried to focus on the conversation. Colonel Sterling was leaning back in his chair, his eyes fixed on Silas with a cold, predatory stillness. The Colonel had spent 40 years reading men's faces in courtrooms, and he didn't like what he saw across the table. He saw a man who was sweating in an air-conditioned breeze. He saw a man whose eyes were darting toward the door every time a floorboard creaked. "You were saying, Silas?" the Colonel prompted, his voice like gravel grinding together. "About the Surveyor's last known location. You claimed he was headed for the Blackwood Swamp." Silas nodded, his throat feeling as though it were being constricted by a hot wire. "Yes, sir. Tricky terrain. A man who doesn't know the turns could easily find himself chest-deep in peat before he realized his mistake." The problem was that Silas was the one who was sinking. Every time he spoke, the vibration of his vocal cords rubbed the collar of his shirt against his throat, grinding the microscopic needles of the nettle reduction into his pores. The tingle was turning into a burn. It was a deep, throbbing heat that felt like he had been splashed with boiling oil. He shifted in his seat, his legs twitching. Beneath the table, his knees were knocking together. He felt a sudden, sharp stab of pain in his armpit. He let out a muffled grunt, his hand clenching his wineglass so hard the stem nearly snapped. He thought he was having an allergic reaction. He thought maybe the kitchen staff had used a tainted spice, or that a spider had crawled into his wardrobe. He didn't look at Zebedee, who was standing by the sideboard, as silent and immovable as a statue. Zebedee watched the sweat pour down Silas's face. He saw the way Silas's skin was beginning to turn a mottled, angry red, where the collar met the jawline. He knew exactly what was happening. The formic acid from the nettles was reacting with the salt in Silas's sweat, creating a chemical fire that no amount of water could quench. But Zebedee's mind wasn't on the pain. He was thinking about the heavy weight tucked into the lining of Silas's waistcoat. He was thinking about the gold watch and the federal seal. Silas was moving so much now, twitching and jerking like a marionette on tangled strings, that the single thread holding the evidence was beginning to groan. The dinner continued in a state of mounting tension. The housemaid, Lurleen, entered with a fresh tray of roasted venison. As she passed Silas, she noticed the way his fingers were clawing at the tablecloth. She looked at Zebedee, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and realization. She had seen the mud on Silas's boots that night. She had found the scrap of the map in the rose bushes. She knew the master was hiding a monster, and she could see that the monster was finally trying to claw its way out. Silas tried to take a bite of the meat, but his jaw was locked in a grimace of agony. The fire had spread down his back and across his chest. It felt as if he were wearing a suit made of wasps. If you don't swallow this kind of well-dressed lie, subscribe. And tell me, was that gold watch a warning or a sentence? Silas couldn't take it anymore. The pain was no longer a physical sensation, it was a psychological assault. He began to hallucinate that he could hear the ticking of the Surveyor's watch coming from inside his own body. Every tick was a needle. Every tock was a burn. He looked at the Colonel, and for a second, the Colonel's face morphed into the face of Mr. Henderson, the man Silas had struck down in the woods. Silas gasped, his chair screeching back against the floor as he stood up abruptly. I need some air," he stammered, his voice a high-pitched whine. "Sit down, Silas," the Colonel said, his voice dropping an octave. "We haven't finished our discussion about the land titles. I've been looking over the deeds you sent me. They're missing the federal seal. It's a curious thing for a man of your experience to overlook." Silas felt the blood drain from his face, leaving it a sickly, translucent grey against the red welts on his neck. He felt the watch shift again. It was sliding down the inside of his waistcoat, held only by a few fraying strands of silk. He could feel the cold metal of the Surveyor's seal pressing against his hip. It felt like a brand. It felt like the dead man was reaching out from the grave to pull him down. The room was silent, save for the sound of Silas's heavy, ragged breathing. He was trapped. If he stayed, the pain would eventually drive him insane. If he ran, he would look guilty of everything the Colonel suspected. He looked toward the kitchen, hoping to see a way out, but he saw only Zebedee. The laundryman's eyes were locked onto the pocket of Silas's waistcoat. There was no pity in those eyes. There was only the cold, hard expectation of a man who had already seen the end of the story. Silas began to scratch his chest, his fingernails digging through the expensive fabric of his shirt. He was tearing at himself, his movements becoming more frantic by the second. "What is wrong with you, man?" the Colonel barked, standing up. "You're acting like a lunatic." Silas didn't answer. He couldn't. The fire had reached his brain. He felt a sudden, sharp pop as the thread in his lining finally gave way. The gold watch, heavy and solid, began to slide. Silas felt it moving. He tried to catch it through the fabric of his coat, his hand clumsily grabbing at his side. But the pain in his armpit flared again, a searing, white-hot spike that made him pull his hand away in a reflex of agony. The Colonel took a step forward, his eyes narrowed. He saw the lump moving beneath Silas's clothes. He saw the way Silas was avoiding his gaze. "Is there something you're hiding, Silas? Something that's making you so uncomfortable?" Silas backed away, his heels hitting the sideboard. A porcelain pitcher shattered on the floor behind him, the sound like a gunshot in the quiet room. The noise pushed Silas over the edge. He let out a strangled cry, his hands flying to his throat as if to rip the burning skin right off his neck. He thought he was being attacked. He thought the Surveyor's ghost was standing right in front of him, wrapping cold, dead fingers around his windpipe. But it was just the Nettles. It was just the formic acid doing its work. Silas's legs gave out and he slumped against the wall, his face contorted in a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. He began to rip at his waistcoat, the buttons popping and flying across the room like tiny wooden bullets. He wanted the clothes off. He wanted the skin off. He didn't care about the Colonel. He didn't care about the land. He only cared about stopping the fire. The Colonel watched in horror and disgust as his son-in-law unraveled in front of him. This wasn't a fever. This was the breakdown of a guilty soul. Silas's hand caught on the inner lining of his coat, and with a final desperate tug, he tore the fabric open. The gold watch tumbled out, its cracked crystal catching the light as it spun through the air. It hit the floor with a heavy metallic thud and slid across the polished wood, coming to rest right at the Colonel's feet. Beside it, the brass Surveyor's seal clattered onto the floor, the federal eagle staring up at the ceiling. The silence that followed was heavier than the watch itself. The Colonel looked down at the items, then slowly reached down to pick them up. He recognized the watch. He had seen it on Henderson's wrist only a month ago. He looked at the dried blood on the fob. He looked at the seal. Then he looked at Silas, who was now huddled on the floor, his shirt torn open, his chest covered in angry white welts and scratches. Silas was sobbing, his dignity stripped away along with his clothes. He looked like a broken animal, caught in a trap of his own making. "The dead have a way of clinging to your clothes, Mr. Vane," the Colonel whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and shock. He looked at the items in his hand, then at the man on the floor. He knew what he had to do. The sterling name would be tarnished, but the law would be upheld. Silas looked up, his eyes bloodshot and pleading, but there was no mercy to be found. He had burned the papers that would have given a good man his freedom. and in return he had been consumed by the very thing he thought he could control. Subscribe. We pull what they tried to bury into the light. And tell me, did Silas ever really think he could get away with it, or was he just waiting for the fire to catch up? The colonel turned to the doorway. "Zebedee," he said, his voice steady now, "go to the stables. Fetch the sheriff. Tell him we have found Mr. Henderson, or at least we have found his killer." Zebedee nodded, a single sharp movement. He turned and walked out into the cool night air, the sound of his boots on the gravel the only rhythm in a world that had just been torn apart. The fire was out, but the ashes were everywhere. The silence in the dining room of the Vane estate was heavier than the gold watch lying on the floor. Silas Vane was no longer the master of his domain. He was a heap of trembling silk and raw red skin huddled in the corner. Colonel Sterling stood over him, the surveyor's watch and the federal seal clutched in his hand. The colonel's face was a mask of cold fury. He wasn't just looking at a murderer. He was looking at a man who had brought federal attention and inevitable ruin to the Sterling family name. Silas tried to speak, his lips bubbling with a mixture of wine and saliva, but the only sound he could produce was a low animalistic whimper. The fire in his skin hadn't faded. If anything, the chemical reaction had reached its peak. The nettle juice was now deep in his nerve endings, and every breath Silas took felt like he was inhaling broken glass. "Look at this. Some people call this the order of things, but it's just a wolf wearing a tailored coat." The colonel turned his gaze from Silas to Zebedee, who remained by the door. "You found these in his coat, didn't you?" the colonel asked, his voice deathly quiet. Zebedee didn't flinch. He didn't look at Silas, he looked straight into the colonel's eyes. "I found a lump in the lining while I was cleaning away the blood on the sleeve, sir," Zebedee replied. He didn't say master. He didn't need to. The power in the room had shifted, and everyone knew it. Silas let out a shriek then, his fingers digging into his own chest, tearing the fine linen shirt into rags. He was scratching so hard that thin lines of blood were beginning to bead on his skin. He thought he was being eaten alive by invisible ants. The colonel realized then that he couldn't hide this. If it had been a local man Silas had killed, the colonel might have buried the body even deeper. But Henderson was a federal officer. The United States Marshals would be coming, and if the colonel was found to be harboring a killer, his own wealth and status would be stripped away. The logic of survival took over. Silas was a liability. He was a broken tool that needed to be discarded. "Where is he, Silas?" the colonel barked, kicking Silas's leg. "Where did you put Henderson?" Silas looked up, his eyes rolling in his head. The pain was making him delirious. "The North Oak," he wheezed. "Under the roots, where the red clay stays wet. He wouldn't sign the titles. He said they were fake. I had to stop him." The confession hung in the air like a thick fog. Silas had just admitted to a capital crime in front of 4 witnesses. He was too far gone to realize that he had just handed himself over to the gallows. He was still scratching, his movements jerky and frantic. The stinging nettles had done more than cause pain. They had stripped away the last of his self-preservation. He was a man possessed by the need to get out of his own skin. Lurline, the housemaid, took a step back, her hand over her mouth. She had seen the mud, she had found the map, but hearing the truth from the master's own mouth was a different kind of horror. Silas continued to babble, talking about the gambling debts and the men in Charleston who were coming for his head. If you can't stand a well-dressed lie, subscribe and tell me, do you think Silas was a monster from the start, or did the debt just bring it out? Silas's breakdown was a physical manifestation of his moral rot. He was literally being consumed by the truth he tried to hide in his clothes. The colonel called for the blacksmith, Otha, and the other men from the stables. He didn't want Silas in the house anymore. He ordered them to take Silas to the stone smokehouse and lock him in. "Keep him there until the sheriff arrives," the colonel commanded, "and if he tries to escape, treat him like any other runaway." It was a cold, calculated move. The colonel was already distancing himself, treating Silas as if he were no longer a member of the family. As they dragged Silas out, his screams echoed across the manicured lawns of the plantation. The guests in the garden, who had been waiting for a toast, stood in shocked silence as they saw the master of the house being hauled away like a common thief, half naked and covered in red welts. The facade was gone. The grand Vane estate was now just a crime scene. Zebedee watched from the shadows of the porch. He felt no joy, only a profound sense of relief. The weight that had been on his shoulders for 10 years was finally starting to lift. But his work wasn't done. He knew the colonel was a man of the law, but he was also a man who protected his own interests. Zebedee needed a final insurance policy. While the house was in chaos, Zebedee walked back to his cabin. He reached under the loose floorboard beneath his bed and pulled out a small weathered tin box. Inside was a second copy of his manumission papers, the original signed document he had paid a traveling lawyer to certify years ago, long before Silas had burned the other set. He had kept it hidden, knowing that one day Silas would betray him. He also had a ledger he had kept in secret, documenting every time Silas had diverted cotton shipments to pay off his private debts that had been hidden from the Sterling family accounts. This was the leverage he needed to ensure the colonel didn't try to keep him or his daughter as part of the estate assets once Silas was gone. Zebedee returned to the main house just as the sheriff's carriage pulled into the drive. The colonel was on the porch, his face pale but composed. He was already preparing the story he would tell the authorities, a story where he was the hero who discovered the crime. Zebedee stepped into the light, the tin box in his hand. The colonel looked at him, his eyes narrowing. "This isn't the time, Zebedee," the colonel snapped. "I have a federal murder to manage." Zebedee didn't move. He opened the box and held out the papers. "Master Silas burned my freedom papers to keep me here," Zebedee said, his voice calm and level. "And he's been stealing from the Sterling accounts for 5 years. It's all in the ledger." The colonel froze. He looked at the ledger, then at the papers. He realized that Zebedee held the key to Silas's complete ruin. If the ledger went to the sheriff, the Sterling family would be sued by the creditors in Charleston for every penny Silas had stolen. But if the ledger disappeared, the colonel could claim ignorance and save his fortune. The price for that silence was Zebedee's freedom and the freedom of his daughter. The colonel looked at the laundryman, seeing him for the first time as a man who was his equal in strategy. "Give me the ledger," the colonel whispered, "and you take your daughter and your papers. You leave before the sun comes up. I'll tell the sheriff you were the one who found the watch, and that I gave you your freedom as a reward." It was a final, dirty deal, but it was the justice Zebedee had been working toward. He handed over the ledger. The colonel took it, his hands shaking slightly. "The sheriff is waiting," the colonel said, turning away. Zebedee didn't wait. He went to the kitchen and found Sarah. They didn't pack much, just a few clothes and the knowledge that they were finally, legally free. They walked out of the estate under the cover of the early morning mist. Behind them, the sounds of the search party heading into the North Woods could be heard. They would find Henderson's body exactly where Silas said it would be. They would find the murder weapon and the blood-stained boots. The case against Silas Vane would be airtight. Silas spent his final days in a stone cell, waiting for the trial that everyone already knew the outcome of. The nettle rash eventually faded, but it left his skin scarred and sensitive. Every time a piece of fabric touched his back, he would flinch, convinced the fire was returning. He was a man undone by a laundryman and a handful of weeds. He was stripped of his land, his title, and eventually his life. He was hanged on a grey Tuesday, the very same day of the week he had burned Zebedee's papers. The colonel kept his fortune, but the Sterling name never recovered from the scandal. The plantation was eventually sold off in pieces to pay the federal fines. Subscribe. Here we pull the truth out of the shadows, no matter who tried to bury it. And tell me, do you think Zebedee was right to make a deal with the colonel, or should he have let the whole family burn? Zebedee and Sarah didn't look back. They headed north toward a life where no one could burn their future in a fireplace. Zebedee kept his hands busy with honest work. But he never forgot the lessons he learned in the laundry shed. He knew that the world was full of men like Silas Vane, men who thought their fine clothes could hide the stains on their souls. But he also knew that no matter how much lie you use, some blood never comes out. Justice isn't always a thunderbolt from the sky. Sometimes it's just a slow, creeping fire in the seams of a waistcoat. The man who thought he was the master was destroyed by the very hands that washed his shirts. The truth, much like a stinging nettle, only hurts when you try to grab it too hard.